Hello, and welcome to this teach out on Afghanistan's displaced people. I'm joined today by Dr. Juan Cole, Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan. He is an academic and commentator on the modern Middle East and South Asia, as well as the founder and chief editor of Informed Comment. Thank you for joining us, Juan.
Thanks for having me.
So to begin, can you please share an overview of the events over the last several years that led to the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan?
Well, the war simply hasn't gone very well in the past few years. Virtually none of the Americans who were sent over there believed in the mission any longer. It was clear that there was enormous corruption, and a lot of the money that the US was pouring into the country was just going into officials' pockets. There were rumors of entire cargo planes taking off full of dollars and heading for Dubai from Kabul airport. So the officers were corrupt. They often had ghost soldiers on the payroll that they told Kabul they were hiring soldiers, but they just kept the salaries in their bank accounts. So President Biden said there were 300,000 Afghan security forces. There were probably a fraction of that because a lot of them were fictional and were a money-making scheme. And then the Taliban have had a resurgence. Their presence in various parts of the country has increased. Their control of certain provinces increased. The Afghan National Army did try to push them back. It did get US support in doing so, especially air support. And it fought valiantly often. They lost as many as 60,000 men in this fight. But in the end, they couldn't turn back the tide of the Taliban advance. A lot of the countries seemed to be dissatisfied with the corruption, with the sense that they were being occupied by a foreign power. And those all fed into Taliban propaganda.
All right, thank you for that important context. That's helpful to understand. So following the evacuation, the Taliban was able to take the Afghanistan government quite rapidly. What were the circumstances that made that possible?
The US military had set up the Afghan military so that it had forward operating bases throughout the country in rural provinces. And these had to be constantly supplied and resupplied with ammunition, war material, weaponry, and even staples. And the US military had been doing that using helicopters. And when President Biden announced that the US military was getting out of Afghanistan entirely, it was expected that the Ashraf Ghani government in Kabul would pick up that slack and that the Afghan National Army would do the deliveries to the forward operating bases. According to the Wall Street Journal, that did not happen. And so these young men out there in these rural provinces, in these isolated bases, were running out of ammunition and they weren't getting more from the capital. There wasn't much prospect of the Kabul government coming to their rescue, and the US was leaving. So they had feelers from the Taliban all along that wouldn't you like to come over to our side? Wouldn't you like to just go back to your civilian life? And at that point, where it became clear that they might be massacred for lack of ammunition, they simply put on their civilian clothes and went home, or in some instances, they joined the Taliban.
So then, what has this takeover meant for Afghanistan's residents?
Well, there's a new government in town with a new ideology, one, of course, to which people had been exposed in the 1990s, although things are different now. But the Taliban are Muslim fundamentalists. They hold to an interpretation of Islam which is rare, is uncommon. That is to say, you won't find the Taliban way of thinking in Cairo, Egypt, a mega city of 20 million, a cosmopolitan place. You won't find it in Tunisia a very modern kind of African country. It's something peculiar to the backwoods of Afghanistan and to some extent to South Asian traditions. So the Taliban firmly believe that women should be seen and not heard, or maybe not seen either. They want all the women to cover up. In the 1990s, they didn't want them going out of the house. And therefore, they weren't allowing schooling of girls they weren't allowing women to go to their work or even to hospital. And they didn't want them to see male doctors. They believe in gender segregation, and of an absolute sort, some people have called it gender apartheid. Now, this time around, there are Taliban in the government who appear not to believe entirely in keeping women within four walls, but they still want them covered up in public. So they've just announced that women can go to college, but must have women-only classes. There can't be any co-education with the boys, and they can't be taught by male teachers. Since there's a dearth of female teachers, this is an obstacle to the women continuing their education. The Taliban have said, well, you could put the men into the classroom on closed circuit TV. So whether they will or can do that, I don't know. But so there's going to be a big change in women's lives. Their opportunities will be constrained. There will be many more restrictions on their movement. We don't know the full extent of these changes yet. In the 90s, the Taliban issued rules about men's comportment too. They had to have a beard. It had to be a certain length. They would measure you. If it wasn't right, they would beat you. They interfered in people's appearances. They wouldn't allow people to be out in the street during prayer time. They had to be in the mosque. There were a lot of draconian rules about how people had to leave. They didn't want people watching Indian Bollywood films in their own living rooms. At that time, it would have been on VHS. They would actually look in people's windows to see if there was flickering of movie watching, which was banned. So it was a highly puritanical regime and disallowed a lot of what we might think of as culture, put very severe constraints on the behavior of individuals in the name of religion. Now, it's 20 years later, Kabul has grown enormously. There's a new middle class. There's a new generation of educated women. There's going to be some pushback on the Taliban. In the 1990s, Afghanistan was largely a rural country and wasn't very connected to the rest of the world. That's changed. So we have to see if the Taliban can be as puritanical this time.
All right. So at this stage, what opportunities are there to improve stability in Afghanistan and the circumstances of the Afghan people?
Well, I am hoping that the international community will resist the temptation to place the Taliban under sanctions. In the past 20 years, the United States in particular, but other countries have gone sanctioned crazy. They've put so many sanctions on Iran that despite denials in Washington, it really is interfering with civilian life. The United States doesn't prevent medicine from coming into Iran, but it designated the central bank as a terrorist organization, so nobody can get paid for shipping medicine to Iran except through the central bank, and then you would be liable to being charged as a terrorist because you dealt with the central bank. So then in fact, a lot of middle-class Iranian or lower middle-class Iranian families, working-class Iranian families can't get the medicines that their relatives need or they need. and aid organizations have complained about these sanctions. So I would hate to see that done to Afghanistan. If you have a problem with the government, deal with the government, but putting sanctions on the whole economy inevitably, and whatever the diplomats say, is going to detract from the quality of life of people. And Afghanistan's economy is about to go off the cliff. It has a population of 38 million, a GDP of only 19 billion. And much of that 19 billion was being generated by the presence of the United States and NATO. With the European and North American powers gone from the country, foreign direct investment is going to stop. Aid money for the military is going to stop. Charitable aid could stop. And that means that Afghanistan is going to suddenly have a GDP maybe the fourth of the size that it was used to. And if you put sanctions on the country on top of all that, you're going to have mass starvation. This is going to be a humanitarian catastrophe.
Wow. So what would you say to people then, both in the United States and around the world, who want to support Afghan displaced people and refugees?
Well, as long as there are no legal obstacles with regard to sanctions, I would say, investigate your favorite charities and human rights organizations, the ones that you think well of, and you can investigate how much of the money they take in they actually spend on doing good, and see who's active in Afghanistan. I mean, there are appeals on the web, and donate. That would be one way to help. And the other thing is, I think Americans underestimate their influence on their own representatives in Congress, and your senators, your congressmen actually care quite a lot what you think. They want your vote and your campaign money if they can get it. And so when they hear from constituents, they pay attention. So let them know that you don't want Afghanistan being sanctioned, and that you want to see some form of USAID activity there continue if the new Taliban government will permit that.
All right, those are great recommendations. Thank you for joining our conversation, Juan. We appreciate your perspective.
Thank you.